I came home to find my trees gone, cut down without warning, without permission, and the worst part? The HOA didn't just destroy my property, they made sure to erase any trace of it as if it never mattered. But the wind didn't forget, and neither did I. I never wanted the fancy views or a house on a golf course like everyone else. After 28 years working with the U.S. Forest Service, I was done with the chaos, the fires, the floods, the constant destruction. I'd spent too many seasons staring at ruined landscapes, helping people pick up the pieces after a fire had turned their world to ash. I'd held stuffed animals in my hands, trying to comfort kids who had just lost everything, and walked beside widows whose homes were just smoldering piles of rubble. So when I retired, I didn't dream of a luxury home with a pool or a beach. I just wanted something simple, a place where I could breathe. And that's when I found it. A small plot of land on the edge of Pine Hollow, the kind of place a realtor would call a useless backside buffer. But to me, it was everything. It was a piece of earth that hadn't been trampled by too many human hands, and I could make it my own. I moved in, set up shop in a modest 2-story house, and immediately started making plans. I knew what this land needed, a windbreak. Something to hold the slope when the rains came to shield my house from the icy winter winds that howled down the valley. A few rows of trees, nothing fancy, Austrian pines, bur oaks, junipers, trees that could handle the wind, the rain, and the sun. I didn't hire anyone to do it. I did it all myself, planting each seedling by hand, making sure each one was positioned just right. I even worked with a state reforestation advisor, someone I'd mentored when I was younger. She helped me with the layout, making sure the trees would do exactly what I needed them to do. It wasn't just landscaping, it was infrastructure. The trees weren't just pretty, they were a barrier against erosion, a shield for the land, a way to give back to the earth that had seen me through the worst of things. And it wasn't just me taking care of it. The neighborhood didn't care much about it, but the trees were part of my life. Over the years, they grew tall and strong. People in the neighborhood would joke that my place looked like it belonged on a calendar with the way the trees filled the space, the birds nesting in their branches, the wind flowing through them in the winter months to keep my house from freezing. It was a good arrangement, quiet. The HOA didn't bother me, and I didn't bother them. Until that day. It started innocently enough. A folded piece of paper taped to my mailbox, no envelope, just a bold notice. Vegetation review for Lot 116. My first thought was, what the hell is this? The language was generic at first, talking about maintaining visual consistency and eliminating overgrowth, but the last paragraph caught my eye. They had identified excessive natural screening and non-standard perimeter foliage that could pose safety risks. I remember standing there, holding the paper in one hand, my coffee in the other, rereading the word excessive over and over. It felt personal, like a slap in the face. But I didn't panic. I'd seen this before. People with too much time on their hands, looking for problems where there were none. It's like they couldn't stand the thought of someone doing something their way. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I drafted a polite letter. I explained everything. The history of the trees, the benefits of the windbreak, how it helped with soil retention and reduced wind chill in the winter. I even attached photos, soil surveys, the whole 9 yards. I thought that would be the end of it. 2 weeks passed. No response. I figured it was just some bureaucratic nonsense, something that would blow over. But then, one weekend, when I was visiting my son near Flagstaff, Maria, my neighbor down the street, called me. She was in tears, her voice shaky. "Wes, you've got to come home. They're cutting your trees down. They've got chainsaws, and there's a crew of guys out there." I don't think I've ever driven so fast in my life. I remember the whole trip back, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, thinking to myself, they wouldn't, not my trees. But they did. By the time I got home, all that was left was a row of stumps, jagged and raw, leaking sap like an open wound. I stood there, staring at the empty slope, feeling like the ground had been ripped from under me. The wind was already picking up, and the silence of the trees was suffocating. It wasn't just the trees they had destroyed, they had erased a part of me. The first time I saw Karen McClintock in person after my trees were gone, I couldn't decide whether to scream or laugh. She was standing at the head of the HOA meeting, looking like she owned the place, which, in a way, she did. She had that polished, all-business demeanor, clipboard in hand, ready to lecture everyone on how community aesthetics were the most important thing in the world. I don't think we'd ever exchanged more than a few brief waves before, and now here she was, taking credit for something that, in my book, could only be called theft. But I wasn't going to storm in, not yet. No, I'd be calm about this. I had to be. The letter in my hand, the maps, the photos, I had all the proof. I wasn't just fighting Karen, I was fighting a system, and I wasn't going to lose my temper over it. So I took a seat at the back of the room, my binder and all my paperwork tucked under my arm. The usual suspects were there. Retirees in golf shirts, yoga moms who probably had no idea what was happening outside their neatly trimmed lawns, and the rest of the HOA's pawns, most of them too polite or too scared to ask questions. The meeting kicked off like it always did. Roll call, the Pledge of Allegiance, a few updates about the neighborhood potlucks no one ever showed up to. I could tell Karen was itching to get to the part that mattered to her, where she'd shine. I knew her game. She'd been waiting for this moment. She'd been waiting to show everyone how efficient the HOA was in beautifying the neighborhood. And then it happened. She clicked a remote and a projector screen came alive behind her. She smiled, that tight, rehearsed smile, the one you give when you know you've got something to prove. The screen lit up with photos, before and after shots of the property. The before picture was of my trees, standing tall and proud, the kind of trees that people like to look at in nature documentaries. The caption beneath read, "Unsafe visual barrier. Obstructed sightlines." My stomach twisted, but I kept my face neutral. And then the after shot came up. It was a barren patch of dirt, jagged stumps where the trees used to be. The caption, "Clean and code compliant." She looked out over the room, hands clasped, her voice sweet and practiced. "We've removed over 70 linear feet of unpermitted, overgrown vegetation that obstructed sightlines and posed a hazard near common space." And just like that, in front of everyone, she claimed my land wasn't mine. She called it an obstruction. My trees, the ones I'd nurtured for years, grown with my own 2 hands. A few heads turned in my direction. I could feel their eyes on me, a few awkward coughs in the air as people tried to process what was being said. I raised my hand. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, her practiced smile wavering. "Yes, Mr. Dalton?" she asked, like I was just another disgruntled homeowner with a complaint. "That's my property," I said, keeping my voice calm but not soft. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. Those trees weren't just a visual barrier, they were a federally protected windbreak, planted after the '98 Ridge Fire, a project I worked on. I've got the papers to prove it. She blinked, almost like she didn't expect that. "I understand the confusion," she said, her voice tight, "but that area falls within the HOA's 30-foot perimeter zone, which we're authorized to maintain under Article 6, Section 3. I didn't even flinch. I opened my binder, flipping through it until I found the map I had printed out. I held it up for her and the rest of the room to see. "That's incorrect," I said, my voice steady. "This land is part of my deed. It's not in your zone. I had it surveyed when I bought the place. These trees are within my lot lines. You want to check? I've got topographic overlays, GPS confirmation, and photos from the day I planted them." Karen's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered, adjusting her glasses and waving it off like it was no big deal. "Mr. Dalton, I don't think this is the right forum for a property dispute. You're welcome to submit a grievance to our landscaping committee if you feel that's necessary." I leaned forward, voice cutting through her like a knife. "I already did. I submitted it 2 weeks ago, and I've heard nothing. You had the trees destroyed without even bothering to contact me. This isn't about aesthetics or safety. This is about you making decisions on things you have no business making decisions about." The room was dead silent now. Karen's face was a mix of irritation and that cold, implacable resolve she had, like she was about to put me in my place. She leaned forward, her voice still controlled but clipped. "The trees weren't approved and their condition was deteriorating. Frankly, we were surprised you didn't volunteer to remove them yourself." Her audacity almost made me laugh. I had spent years planting those trees, watching them grow, caring for them like they were my children. And now she was acting like they were just some overgrown bush in a corner. I didn't let myself laugh, though. I didn't even crack a smile. Instead, I said, "They were healthy trees. You had no right to remove them. You just didn't want to listen to anyone who wasn't on the board." She tilted her head, raising an eyebrow. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Dalton?" she asked, her tone suddenly sharper. "No," I said flatly, "but nature is." Rick, the board member who usually kept his mouth shut, leaned in and whispered something to Karen. She waved him off, eyes still fixed on me, but it was too late. The seeds of doubt had been planted. I wasn't just some cranky neighbor with an overgrown yard. I was a man with evidence, and I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Karen gave me that smile again, the one that felt like a threat in disguise. "You're welcome to speak with our legal liaison," she said, dismissing me with a flick of her hand. "This discussion is over." I didn't stay to hear the rest. I walked out of there, my ears ringing, and as I left, the silence of the room seemed to follow me out the door. It was like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. But as I drove home, I already knew what I'd do. I wasn't about to let them get away with this. This wasn't just about trees. This was about standing up for what was mine. I thought I could handle it. I really did. I sent the complaint, I gathered all my evidence, and I waited. I figured the board would see reason, realize they'd overstepped, and back down. But that was before I found out just how deep this whole thing went and just how far they were willing to push. 2 weeks passed and I didn't hear a word. I figured it was just more bureaucracy, a paper shuffle behind closed doors. I tried to put it out of my mind, focused on my life. Then, one weekend, I decided to head over to Slaughter Flagstaff to visit my son, Ethan. I needed a break. We'd planned it for months, and with everything going on, it felt like the right time. I left the house, locked the door, and thought for sure that by the time I came back, the HOA would have come to their senses. But of course, that's not what happened. Maria called me in the middle of the night, her voice frantic. "Wes, they're cutting your trees down. There's a whole crew out there with chainsaws." I wasn't even sure I'd heard her right at first. "What do you mean? Who's cutting them down?" "HOA," she gasped. "A crew of contractors. They've got papers, Wes. It's official. I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen." I don't even remember how I got back to Pine Hollow. I think I blacked out for part of the drive. All I know is I was gripping the wheel so hard my hands were cramping, my mind racing, thinking there's no way this is happening. No way. By the time I got home, it was too late. The sound of chainsaws still echoed in my head. I pulled up to my house, my breath catching in my chest as I looked at the empty slope where my trees used to be. They were gone. Every single one. Stumps, jagged and raw, dotted the landscape like the remnants of a battle that no one had warned me about. It wasn't just the loss of trees, it was the loss of something I had carefully built, piece by piece, year after year, and they'd just wiped it away without a second thought. I remember standing there staring at the stumps, the dust swirling around me. My dog Till, bless him, sat by my side, whimpering softly. I didn't know if I was more angry or just numb. I knew right then that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't about aesthetics or needing to keep the neighborhood pretty. No, this was personal. They'd done this on purpose. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the old fire I thought I'd left behind. The kind of fire I felt chasing arsonists through the Nevada wildfires. I took a deep breath, clenching my fists, trying not to let it overwhelm me. There was no time to fall apart. Not yet. But I knew one thing. This wasn't over. I needed to figure out what the hell had just happened, and fast. I wasn't just going to roll over. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, poring over every document, every map, every email, trying to understand how they could do this. I even called my lawyer, August, in the middle of the night. He wasn't thrilled to hear from me, but when I explained the situation, he went quiet. "This is bad, Wes," he said. "They don't have the authority to do this. If they've destroyed your property without consent, we've got a strong case. But you need to start documenting everything, every conversation, every detail. If this thing escalates, we need to have a paper trail." That was my first clue that this wasn't just some neighborly disagreement. This was going to turn into something much bigger. I could feel it in my gut. But even then, I didn't realize just how far Karen and the board would take it. The next day, I filed a police report, not because I expected the sheriff to do anything, but because I knew the paper trail would matter down the road. The deputy who came out wasn't much help. He took a few pictures, asked a few questions, but mostly looked like he didn't understand what the big deal was. "You're saying this was all on your property?" he asked, squinting at the stumps. I pulled out the survey map. "Right here, see that red line? That's my lot. Those trees were my trees." The deputy shrugged. "Well, HOA says they thought it was common area. I don't know what to tell you, but I'll make a note of it. You might want to follow up with civil channels." I couldn't believe it. They thought it was common area? They hadn't even bothered to check? It was all just so careless, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I already knew I needed to take this to a higher level. So I called Nancy Yates, my old colleague at the State Urban Forestry Division. She remembered the tree line. She helped me with the original planting proposal. "Wes, you don't just clear something like that without permission," she told me over the phone. "Those trees were part of a federally recognized wind mitigation project. If they're destroyed without review, that could come back to bite the HOA big time. Especially if we get a strong windstorm. If that happens, the HOA could be looking at some serious liability." I felt my stomach drop. I knew exactly what she was talking about. Pine Hollow wasn't some ordinary neighborhood. The wind here, especially coming down off the ridgelines, was no joke. It could tear through this place like a freight train if there was nothing to stop it. And now, without those trees, there was nothing. I spent the next few days documenting everything. Photos, maps, wind trajectory notes, anything I could gather. I wasn't about to let them pretend like they didn't know what they'd done. I even took a video showing how the wind now moved through the area, the way it whipped straight toward the clubhouse, which was wide open. No trees, no protection, just a glass-walled building waiting to get pummeled. But Karen and the board weren't backing down. They continued to claim they'd acted in good faith, that the trees were a hazard, and that they'd done everyone a favor by removing them. I filed a formal complaint with the city zoning office, sent copies of all my documents to the State Department of Environmental Conservation. I wasn't going to sit back and let them bulldoze me, but it was like they weren't even paying attention. And then, the storm warning started coming in. I remember watching the weather forecast, seeing the high wind warnings pop up. The gusts were supposed to be strong, 55-mile-per-hour winds sweeping through the ridge. I knew exactly what that meant. The wind was coming for them, and it wasn't going to care about any of their bylaws or their so-called community beautification, and I wasn't about to sit by and let them ignore it. At first, I kept thinking if I just stayed calm, if I stuck to the facts, I could make this right. I wasn't the kind of guy who liked to stir the pot, but I wasn't about to let the HOA bulldoze my rights either. So I kept my cool. I reached out to everyone I could think of, lawyers, government offices, the city zoning office, and tried to get them to see reason. I started with a formal complaint to the city. I wanted them to know exactly what had happened, how the HOA had destroyed something on my property without my consent. I filed everything, maps, photos, the original planting proposal, everything. But the silence that followed was almost worse than the chainsaws. A few weeks passed and not a single response. I'd been around long enough to know how this kind of thing works. Bureaucracy drags its feet, especially when the people involved have more power than they let on. So I tried again. I went to the zoning office in person this time. I had my papers, my maps, my well-documented proof. I thought maybe, just maybe, getting face-to-face would get them to take me seriously. The receptionist looked up at me over her glasses and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're Mr. Dalton, right? The guy with the trees?" That stung more than I cared to admit. It wasn't just the guy with the trees. Those trees were part of something bigger, something that meant a hell of a lot more than just a few shrubs on my lawn. But I didn't let her see my frustration. I nodded and handed over the folder I'd prepared. "I need you to take a look at this. The HOA tore down a federally protected windbreak that I planted after the 1998 ridge fire. They didn't get my permission, and they didn't even bother to check the land boundaries. This is more than just landscaping. It's a violation of environmental protection laws." She took the papers and flipped through them, scanning quickly. I could see her thinking, trying to figure out how to make this go away. "Well, this is definitely unusual. I'll submit it to the zoning board for review." "Unusual?" "No, this is illegal," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. They just wiped it out, and now there's nothing to stop the wind from tearing up this entire neighborhood. I could see she was getting uncomfortable. She nodded slowly, taking down notes. "I'll send this up the chain, but Mr. Dalton, you should know these things can take time. A lot of time." I didn't want to hear that. I didn't want to be told that this was just another bureaucratic delay. I had already seen enough of that. The wind was coming, and it wasn't going to wait around for paperwork, but I had to bite my tongue. "Just make sure it gets to the right people," I said, forcing a smile. "And let me know if you need anything else." She nodded again, but I could tell she wasn't as convinced as I was. The entire system felt like a game, and I was playing catch-up. After that, I decided to take it to the next level. I called Nancy Yates. She had been with me from the start, helping me with the planting plan all those years ago, and I knew she had the credentials to back me up. She had a good reputation in the state, and if there was anyone who could back up my case, it was her. When I explained what had happened, there was a long pause on the line. I could hear her shuffling through papers in the background. Finally, she spoke, her voice full of concern. "Wes, this is a problem. If they remove those trees without proper authorization, it's not just a zoning issue. You're talking about violating a federally protected windbreak. You could be looking at significant liability here, especially if the wind causes damage to the neighborhood." I felt the weight of those words settle over me. "I know, that's what I'm worried about. I've been trying to get the city to do something, but they're dragging their feet." Nancy let out a breath. "I can escalate this to the state's urban forestry division, but you have to be prepared for the fact that the HOA is going to fight this. They won't back down easily." I wasn't expecting them to. If anything, I was bracing myself for the exact opposite. I had seen the way Karen and the board worked. They had their pride, and they didn't give up control easily. They'd already shown me how far they were willing to go to push their agenda. "I don't care how long it takes," I told Nancy. "I just need someone to listen, someone who understands what those trees were for, what they meant. I can't let them get away with this." Nancy gave me a soft chuckle, but I could hear the support in her voice. "All right, I'll get the ball rolling, but don't expect it to be quick. You need to gather every single piece of documentation you can. Letters, photos, anything that proves those trees were important." I'd already been doing that, but now I knew it wasn't enough. I had to get the state involved. I needed leverage. So I spent the next few days digging through every piece of paperwork I had, sending certified letters to the HOA, the landscaping contractor they hired, and their insurance company. I sent everything, maps, surveys, even old reforestation documents from when I originally planted the trees. But still, the silence continued. It was like I was shouting into an abyss, waiting for someone, anyone, to hear me. After a week of no response, I got a call from Maria, my neighbor. She had been on my side since day one. I could hear the worry in her voice when she told me, "Wes, I don't think they're going to stop. Karen's been pushing harder than ever, and now they're talking about filing some sort of counterclaim against you. They say you didn't have proper approval for the trees. She's spinning this like you're the one who's in the wrong." I leaned against the wall, staring out the window at the bare slope where my trees used to stand. I knew it. They're not going to give up without a fight, are they? Number. But Wes, don't back down. We know what they did was wrong. I took a deep breath, my resolve solidifying. It didn't matter how long it took or how much they pushed back. I wasn't going to let them turn this into my fault. I wasn't going to let them erase the truth. So I kept pushing. I kept filing complaints, reaching out, sending emails. I wasn't going to let them wear me down. I had to believe that if I just kept at it, someone would listen. Eventually, someone had to. I thought I was ready for anything at that point. I had my case, my evidence, everything lined up. Sure, the HOA was fighting back hard, but I figured eventually the truth would win out. Then came the moment when everything shifted, and I realized just how much deeper this went than I'd ever thought. It started with an email from Nancy. She had escalated things to the State Urban Forestry Division, and I was expecting some kind of official response, maybe a review of my case. But what I got was a warning. "Wes, I've been digging into this, and there's something you need to know. I'm getting word that the HOA has been in touch with a lawyer who specializes in environmental liability. They're gearing up for a full-on legal battle, and they're not just trying to fight you on property boundaries, they're going after the windbreak itself. They're calling it a non-standard use of federal land." I sat there, staring at the screen, my stomach sinking. Non-standard use of federal land? What the hell was she talking about? I picked up the phone and dialed her number immediately, barely waiting for the ring before she picked up. "Wes, listen to me. The HOA is digging into your background, trying to discredit everything about this project. They're claiming that the grant you used to plant those trees wasn't valid, that they were never actually part of the official restoration effort. They're digging up old paperwork, even some from before your time, trying to make it look like this whole thing was a mistake from the start." The room felt like it was closing in on me. "What do you mean, a mistake?" This was a legitimate federal project. Those trees weren't just some random planting, they were part of the ridge-fire recovery efforts. I've got the paperwork right here. "I know, Wes, I know, but the lawyer they're working with has a history of finding little holes to exploit in cases like this. He's trying to argue that the windbreak wasn't part of the official federal land use because of the way it was planted. They're going to try to twist this around so that it looks like you were out of line from the beginning, like you acted on your own and made an unapproved change to federally protected land." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the anger rise in my chest, hot and swift. This wasn't just about my trees anymore. They were trying to erase the entire point of what I had done. The work I had put into this land, into protecting it, into creating something that actually helped the neighborhood. They were trying to make it all disappear. "They're rewriting history," I muttered. "All this time I've spent documenting it, trying to make things right, and now they're trying to make it seem like I was the one in the wrong the entire time. That I'm some rogue homeowner who just decided to plant trees wherever I wanted." Nancy was quiet for a moment. I could hear her shuffling papers on her end of the line, thinking, probably trying to find a way out of this mess. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you, Wes. They're digging into your past work. They're trying to pull everything they can to discredit you. But here's the thing. They can't do this without making a mistake. They're overreaching, and they're bound to slip up. If we can catch them on one thing, just one, it could turn everything around." I was about to respond when I noticed something strange, something that made my heart skip a beat. Through my window, I could see Karen's car parked near the clubhouse. I'd seen that SUV enough times to recognize it without thinking. But what struck me wasn't just her car. It was the way she was pacing back and forth in front of the clubhouse, her phone pressed to her ear. I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed my camera and snapped a few pictures from my window. At that point, I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just instinct. But I watched her for a while, the way she was acting so desperate. Her shoulders were tense and she looked like she was having a heated conversation, her hand flying in the air as she gestured toward the clubhouse. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. I wasn't the only one who was feeling the pressure. I made a decision then. I wasn't going to wait around for things to get worse. I had been quiet for too long, and now they were trying to rewrite everything I had done. I decided to go down to the HOA office and confront Karen face to face. I gathered my papers, everything I had documented, all the emails, the legal notices, and walked out the door. The moment I stepped into the clubhouse, I could feel the tension in the air. Karen was standing behind the reception desk, still on the phone, but as soon as she saw me, she hung up without a word. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice tight. I could see her trying to keep it cool, but there was something about her that was different. She wasn't the confident woman who had been so smug in our last meeting. She was on edge. "I need to talk to you, Karen. Right now," I said, stepping forward. She paused, her face turning a little pale, but she didn't back down. "You're going to have to make an appointment," she said quickly, almost too quickly. I shook my head. This isn't about making an appointment. This is about what you've done, about what you're trying to cover up." Her eyes flicked to the side, and for a moment I thought I saw something, guilt maybe. It was gone too quickly to be sure, but it was enough to make me press harder. "The truth is out, Karen. You can't keep hiding behind your so-called aesthetic concerns. I know what you're trying to do. You're rewriting history to cover your own mistakes, and you're not going to get away with it." She didn't say anything for a long while. She just stood there, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. I didn't even need to say it. She knew I was right. But just before she could respond, something shifted. A few of the board members started trickling in. Rick, the quiet guy from the board, was there too. He didn't look comfortable, not at all. He kept glancing at me like he was waiting for someone else to say something. Then, without warning, Karen said, "Mr. Dalton, if you think you have a case, take it up with the legal team. We've already consulted our lawyer. You're wasting your time." She wasn't even looking at me now. She was already moving back behind her desk, as if she had no intention of dealing with this anymore, but I wasn't about to back down. "Mark my words, Karen," I said, stepping closer. "You've just opened a door that's going to blow everything wide open, and when it does, I'm not the only one you'll have to answer to." She didn't respond, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. She was looking at a piece of paper on her desk, something I couldn't quite make out. And then, for the first time in this entire mess, I realized she wasn't just trying to cover her own back. She was in deeper than I had thought. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was about to become something much bigger. That moment with Karen was a turning point for me. It was like a switch flipped. I'd been coasting, thinking I could reason with the HOA, thinking I could play by the rules, but they weren't interested in playing fair. They were willing to rewrite everything, and I couldn't just sit back and let it happen anymore. I had to take control. The problem was, I didn't know where to start. This was bigger than a few trees being cut down. This was about proving that the HOA had overstepped, that they'd knowingly broken laws, and that they were trying to cover it up with some half-baked legal maneuver. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much was at stake. This wasn't just about the land. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, especially when they think they're untouchable. So I did what I always do when I'm facing something I don't fully understand. I started making a plan. A solid, step-by-step plan. I wasn't just going to get mad and throw my hands up. I was going to use this frustration, this rage, to fuel something bigger. The first step was to talk to August, my lawyer. He had been quiet for a while, mostly because there wasn't much to do except wait for a response from the city. But now, things were different. I wasn't waiting anymore. I needed him to take action, and I needed him to know that I wasn't going to back down. I called him the next morning. "August, we need to move on this. We've got proof that the HOA destroyed my property without permission. I'm not going to let them sweep this under the rug." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Wes, I've been waiting for you to say that. I thought you might be ready, but I wasn't sure if you'd want to go full force with this." I could hear the smile in his voice, but it wasn't a reassuring one. It was the kind of smile that says, "I've been waiting for you to wake up." "I'm all in," I said, my voice firm. "They're messing with the wrong guy. I need you to help me gather everything we've got, every piece of documentation, every photo, every survey. If they want to fight, they've got one." He chuckled, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was more like a soldier getting ready for battle. "All right, Wes, I'll start pulling everything together. I'll get the state involved, get some of the experts in urban forestry on our side. But let's not kid ourselves. We're up against a board with some deep pockets. They've got a legal team that's been waiting for this. If we're going to win, we need to be smarter." Smarter. That word stuck with me. It wasn't just about the trees. It was about outmaneuvering them at every turn, using the very laws they were trying to manipulate against them. I knew I had to play it like a chess game, carefully, strategically. This wasn't going to be over in a few weeks or even a few months. It was going to take time, and I had to make sure every move I made counted. The next step was to get the press involved. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every homeowner in Pine Hollow who was tired of the HOA overstepping, tired of being bullied by a system that didn't give a damn about their rights. I knew the media could help put pressure on the HOA, expose what they were doing to the public. It was about time people knew the truth. I called up an old friend, a reporter named Daniel Reed. He used to cover environmental stories for the Pine County Tribune back when I worked with the Forest Service. He was someone I trusted to tell the story the right way. When I explained what had been going on, I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. "This is bigger than just a few trees, isn't it?" he asked. "Much bigger. They've crossed a line, and I'm not letting them get away with it," I said, feeling the fire building in my chest. Daniel was on board from the start. "All right, Wes, I'm in. I'll dig into this, get some background on the HOA, get the story out there. You've got the evidence, I've got the contacts. We'll make sure this goes public." That was the turning point. I wasn't just fighting for my trees anymore. I was fighting for the whole neighborhood, for every person who'd ever been ignored or manipulated by a system that was supposed to be there to protect them. And now I had a team. August handling the legal side, Nancy backing us up with the environmental angle, and Daniel pushing the story to the public. It wasn't just about going to court anymore. It was about making sure the HOA knew we weren't afraid of them. But I knew we needed more. It wasn't enough to just have the law and the press on our side. We needed a way to really hit them where it hurt. That's when I remembered something Karen had said in passing during one of our meetings. She'd mentioned a consulted arborist, someone who had given them advice on removing the trees. That was the next piece of the puzzle. I needed to find out who this arborist was. If they had any connection to the board, or if they were just some hired hand who didn't know the first thing about wind mitigation or federally protected land, it could blow the whole case wide open. I had a feeling they weren't working with a qualified expert at all, and that could be the leverage we needed to push the case forward. I called Nancy again. "I need to know about the arborist they hired, the one who supposedly gave them the green light. Can you dig into that for me?" She didn't hesitate. "Leave it to me, Wes. I'll find out who they're working with." The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many layers there were to this thing. Every move the HOA made, every lie they tried to cover up, it was all coming undone. I just had to stay one step ahead. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't walking away until they paid for what they'd done. So I formulated my plan. Hit them with everything we had, legally, in the media, and behind the scenes. I wasn't going to let them spin this. They wanted to fight dirty? Fine. Let's see who could fight harder. And when the dust finally settled, I was going to make sure they realized exactly who they were dealing with. I wasn't about to sit back and let them steamroll me. I had everything I needed: evidence, allies, and, most importantly, the truth on my side. But as soon as I started making moves, it didn't take long for the HOA to strike back. And let me tell you, they weren't playing around. They came at me from every angle, throwing everything they could at me in an attempt to shut me down. It started with an email from Karen. It was brief but sharp, one of those passive-aggressive ones where she tried to sound polite, but you could hear the thinly veiled threat beneath the surface. She basically told me that if I didn't cease and desist with my media campaign, the HOA would take legal action. It wasn't just a warning. It was a message that they were willing to do whatever it took to shut me up. I wasn't surprised. I'd known it was coming. But what really got me wasn't the email itself. It was the fact that they were trying to manipulate the media. They'd already contacted some of the local outlets, spinning the narrative that I was a troublemaker who was trying to stir up a fight over something trivial. They even went as far as to tell the press that I was just some bitter homeowner angry about a few trees being cut down, and that I was unwilling to accept the HOA's decision. I wasn't the only one getting heat. Daniel, my reporter friend, had his own set of problems. The HOA had sent a formal letter to his editor, demanding that he drop the story, claiming it was a baseless personal vendetta. It wasn't even subtle. They were trying to bury the truth before it could even get out. But it didn't matter. I had expected them to try to spin the story. What surprised me was how aggressive they got. They tried to scare me off, thinking I'd back down just because they had a little bit of power behind them. They were wrong. That only lit the fire under me more. I wasn't going to let them win just by being louder. I was going to hit them harder. I called August right away. "We need to counter this. They're coming at us full force now. They've gone after the press. They've made threats. They're trying to intimidate me." I could hear August shift in his chair, already thinking ahead. "Wes, I figured this was coming. We can't back down now. They want to fight, they're gonna get one. I want to go on the offensive. We've got the media on our side, but we need more. We need to put them on the defensive. That's when August suggested we get the state's environmental agency involved more directly. It wasn't just about the trees anymore. This was a case of negligent destruction of federally protected land. If we could get the agency to launch a formal investigation into the HOA's actions, it would be a game changer. It would force them to defend their actions in a way they weren't prepared for. So we went all in. I made a few calls to Nancy and got the ball rolling with the state. I gave them everything, my documentation, the photos, everything that proved the trees were part of a federally recognized mitigation project. I knew this was going to take time, but now, with the pressure mounting, I could feel the tide starting to shift. While that was happening, I knew I had to keep the media pressure on them. Daniel had already written his first piece, which came out like a bombshell. It laid out the whole story, how the HOA had destroyed the trees, how they were trying to cover up their actions, and how they had been ignoring the rules from the start. It wasn't just about the trees anymore, it was about corruption, manipulation, and a neighborhood under siege by its own HOA. The piece hit the local news, and it spread like wildfire. The moment it went live, the HOA's press secretary called me. He was furious, trying to spin it, saying it was a one-sided story, that they had acted in good faith, and that I was misunderstanding the situation. But there was no turning back now. The public knew, the press knew, and now we had the momentum. It was only a matter of time before the HOA had to respond, and when they did it poorly. They held a public meeting, trying to calm the storm, to downplay the damage they had caused. But the room wasn't full of the usual compliant faces. This time, there were people who weren't afraid to speak up. Neighbors who had been too scared to get involved before were now standing up and calling out the HOA for what they were doing. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been trampled by this group. Karen tried to put on a brave face, but I could see her cracking. She started contradicting herself, stumbling over her words. It was clear she wasn't prepared for this level of public scrutiny, and I knew the pressure was getting to her. But the real punch came when August dropped the bombshell. He had been working behind the scenes, talking to people who had ties to the HOA's legal team. Turns out, the attorney they had hired had a questionable past, to put it mildly. He had been involved in multiple cases where he'd bent the rules, even used some questionable legal tactics to win cases. August had found a few legal precedents where this lawyer had been sanctioned by the bar for unethical behavior. When August revealed that to the board at the next meeting, the entire room fell silent. Karen's face drained of color. She tried to brush it off, but I could see the cracks forming. It was a perfect move. It was like the ground beneath them started to give way. The people on the board could no longer ignore the fact that they were dealing with a lawyer who might not have had the credentials they thought he did. The whole thing began to unravel. Now the HOA was backpedaling, scrambling to cover up their mistakes. They tried to push back with more legal threats, but it was too late. They were playing catch-up. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't going to be an easy win, but it was a win. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for every person in Pine Hollow who had ever been silenced, every homeowner who had ever felt like the HOA was invincible. And just like that, the battle had shifted. The power was no longer in their hands. It was in mine. The moment I had been waiting for finally arrived, and it came with a punch. We had the momentum now, and it was time to make the HOA pay for everything they'd done. The press was on our side. The state was starting to take our case seriously, and all the little cracks in the HOA's carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. But it wasn't enough to just sit back and watch it fall apart. We needed to expose everything for what it truly was: corruption, power, manipulation, and let the whole neighborhood know that they had been living under the thumb of a system that didn't give a damn about their rights. I remember the day the article came out. Daniel had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, digging into everything about the HOA. He had spoken with a few former board members, dug through old records, and even tracked down some people who had left the neighborhood years ago after falling out with the board. He pieced together a story that wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about how Karen and the board had been running the HOA like a personal fiefdom, making shady deals, ignoring the rules, and pushing through whatever they wanted with no regard for the residents. When the article hit, it felt like the air in the neighborhood shifted. Daniel had framed it perfectly, showing how the HOA had trampled over my rights and the rights of everyone who lived there. He even got a few people to go on record, some brave neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before, but now that the pressure was on, they finally felt like they had a voice. They told their stories about how the HOA had bullied them over minor infractions, how they'd been fined for things that made no sense, and how, when they tried to question the board, they were shut down or ignored. The piece went viral locally. People were talking about it at the grocery store, at the coffee shop, hell, even at the gym. The HOA couldn't hide anymore. Their actions were out in the open, and people were finally starting to realize what had been going on behind closed doors. And let me tell you, when the truth came out, it wasn't pretty. But the best part came when the HOA tried to respond. Karen called an emergency board meeting trying to rally the troops. She wanted to calm the storm, try to downplay the article, and shift the narrative back in her favor. She came out swinging, of course, claiming that the article was a smear job, that I was just a disgruntled homeowner who didn't understand the bigger picture. She tried to make herself out to be the victim, painting a picture of someone just doing their job, trying to keep the neighborhood safe and beautiful. The problem was people weren't buying it anymore. The meeting was packed. Normally, the room would have a few stragglers here and there, but this time, the place was standing room only. You could feel the tension in the air, and as Karen made her usual speech, I could see it. The doubt, the skepticism in people's eyes. They were starting to realize that maybe they'd been taken for a ride all these years. I wasn't going to just sit back and let her spin the story. I stood up, and I don't think I've ever been that calm and clear-headed in my life. "Karen," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you can't keep hiding behind the same tired excuses. You've taken down trees that were part of a federal project, you've lied about the zoning laws, and you've tried to cover it all up. And now you're trying to make it look like this is all my fault? You've manipulated people for long enough." The room went quiet. I swear you could hear a pin drop. Karen shot me a look that could have frozen water, but I didn't care anymore. The truth was out, and I wasn't backing down. "I've got proof of everything," I continued. "Documents, photos, testimonies. I've got the press on my side and the states starting to look into your actions. This isn't just about a few trees anymore. This is about how you've been running this HOA like your own personal kingdom, taking people's money, making up rules as you go, and using fear and intimidation to get your way." Karen's face turned red, but she didn't say anything. She knew I was right. I could feel the room shifting again, more heads nodding, more people starting to look at her with that same look of realization. She had lost control. It wasn't just me anymore. It was everyone who had ever felt pushed around by the HOA. The neighbors were finally speaking up, the ones who had been too afraid to say anything before now that the pressure was on. One by one, people got up and shared their stories. It was like a dam had broken. People talked about ridiculous fines for tiny issues, unfair penalties for things that weren't even in the HOA's bylaws, and how Karen and her cronies had been using their power to push people around. It was a wave of support I never expected. I had thought I was fighting this alone, but I was wrong. The more I pushed, the more people started to stand with me, and that was the real game changer. The HOA wasn't just facing me, they were facing an entire community that was finally waking up. The meeting ended with Karen trying to save face, but the damage was done. People weren't listening to her anymore. They saw her for what she was, someone more interested in control than in community. The trust was gone. And that was when I knew, for sure, that we had won. I wasn't done yet, though. I wasn't about to just walk away and let them off the hook, but the victory was already starting to feel real. The whole neighborhood was on edge, and the HOA was scrambling. They had no idea how to handle the press, the mounting evidence, or the growing number of people who were turning on them. That night, I sat on my porch, looking out at the bare spot where my trees used to stand. The wind was starting to pick up, like it always did at dusk, but this time it didn't feel as threatening. It felt like a new beginning. The HOA had finally been exposed for what they were, and as long as I had breath in my lungs, I wasn't going to let them forget it. I won't lie. It feels good to be on the other side of it. It's like all that tension, all that frustration, just melted away once it was all out in the open. I thought winning would feel like a huge explosion of joy, like some grand victory speech at the end of a movie. But honestly, it's more like the calm after the storm. Karen and the rest of the HOA board, they're still trying to pick up the pieces, but it's clear the game has changed. The press coverage, the state investigation, the public pressure, it all came together. The board had to resign, and they've since been replaced with people who actually seem to give a damn about the neighborhood. It's not perfect, but it's better than it was. As for me, I'm just glad it's over. I can finally get back to my land, my house, and just living again. The restoration of the Windbreak is coming along, thanks to the support of some local environmental groups and a few neighbors who stepped up to help. The trees are growing back, slower than I'd like, but there's a certain kind of peace that comes with watching them take root once more. Every time I walk out there, I see new growth, new life, and it feels like a personal victory. My neighbors? They're different too, more involved, more aware of what's going on around them. I've had a few of them stop by just to thank me for standing up. One of them, an older lady who's lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, said something that stuck with me. "You did more than fight for your trees, Wes. You fought for all of us." I don't think I realized that until she said it. It wasn't just about the trees or the HOA. It was about taking a stand for something bigger, something that mattered to everyone. And honestly, that feels better than any victory I could have imagined. The funny thing is, even though I'm relieved it's over, I've noticed something in myself. I'm not as quick to back down anymore. I don't know if it's because of everything that happened or just the fact that I finally pushed back against something that felt wrong, but I've realized something. Sometimes standing up for what's right is the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's also the most worthwhile. And now I know that. The land's quieter now. No more HOA meetings, no more surprise inspections, no more feeling like I'm constantly at war. And as I sit here, with Till at my feet and the wind blowing gently through the new trees, I can't help but think that maybe it was all worth it. All the stress, the battles, the sleepless nights, if nothing else, it taught me that you can fight the system, even when it feels like the system is too big to beat. I still get the occasional email from the new HOA board, but it's mostly about community events, making sure we're all keeping our yards up to code. I'm not bothered by it anymore. It's funny how a little bit of peace makes everything else feel so much lighter. The world feels a bit more manageable, like I've got a little piece of it back. So here I am, in the same house, the same land, but with a new outlook. The trees are coming back, the neighborhood is healing, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I guess it's true what they say. Sometimes you have to fight for what you love, but it's worth it when you win.